I genuinely believe that men were put on this planet Earth to knock us silly with some logic and reason, because God knows that women do not have it. I'm sorry, we don't. We like to go shopping. We like to eat food. We like to watch Netflix and sit on the couch all day. Meanwhile, men are going to their jobs every single day, not complaining. They're always happy-go-lucky. Truly, God bless a man's soul, because I don't think us women ever fully grow up. And our husbands are now our daddy.
For decades, society has been running an experiment, and most people did not realize they were a part of it until the results started showing up everywhere at once. We were told that everything would improve if traditional roles disappeared, if responsibility was redefined, and if independence replaced interdependence. Now the economy is tightening, jobs are vanishing, automation is accelerating, and suddenly the confidence that once filled every social media post has been replaced with panic. What happens when a generation that was told it needed no one realizes that survival is not as simple as slogans made it sound? Stay with me to the very end of this video, because what we are witnessing right now is not just a trend, it is a turning point. And before we go any further, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, selecting all notifications so you never miss an Angry Guy upload. If you want every video the moment it goes live, that bell matters more than you think. Yeah, I also want you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you care about protecting your assets, learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, and building real financial resilience in uncertain times, the Academy is where you start. The link is right there, so go check it out after this video. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. That support keeps this channel running and allows me to keep making content that does not pull punches. Now, let us talk about what is happening, not with slogans, not with insults, but with clarity and honesty. We are watching a growing number of women online openly admit something that was once considered unacceptable to say out loud, which is that life is becoming unmanageable without the support of men. This is not coming from one country, one platform, or one demographic. It is appearing across social media, across age groups, and across economic classes. The same voices that spent decades insisting they did not need men are now saying they cannot survive without help. The tone has shifted from celebration to desperation. And that shift did not happen by accident. For roughly 50 years, men were told in no uncertain terms that they were no longer necessary. They were told to step aside, to stop approaching, to stop leading, to stop protecting, and to stop providing. They were told their instincts were wrong, their presence was unwanted, and their role was outdated. Many men resisted at first, because walking away from society goes against how most men are wired. But eventually, after years of being criticized, blamed, and sidelined, men listened. They did not riot. They did not beg. They simply withdrew. What happened next surprised almost everyone, except the men themselves. Once they stepped back, many men discovered something they had not been allowed to feel before, which was peace. Solitude, when chosen rather than imposed, turned out not to be suffering at all. Men learned that being alone is not the same as being lonely. They learned how quiet their minds became when constant conflict was removed from their lives. They learned that they could build routines, stability, and even joy without being in a system that constantly demanded more while offering less. While men were quietly adapting, the world kept changing. Jobs that once required human labor began to disappear. Entire industries started shrinking. Automation and artificial intelligence moved faster than expected, and many of the positions most vulnerable to replacement were roles dominated by women. Customer service, administrative work, entry-level corporate positions, and social media-driven careers proved far less stable than promised. The safety net people believed would always be there began to fray. For decades, the message was that the state would replace the role of men. If anything went wrong, assistance programs, corporate policies, or institutional support would fill the gap. But states run on money, and money runs out. As economic pressure increases, support systems tighten, benefits shrink, competition increases. And suddenly, many people are discovering that institutional promises do not feel very personal when times get hard. This is where the tone online begins to change. Instead of celebrating independence, we see posts expressing fear about rent, food, and the future. Instead of mocking traditional relationships, we see discussions about marriage, partnership, and stability. Instead of rejecting men outright, we see appeals for men to return, to date again, to commit again, and to provide again. But what many of these voices fail to understand is that men are not standing where they used to stand. Men did not just walk away physically, they walked away psychologically. Years of being told they were harmful, unnecessary, or replaceable had an effect. Men learned to trust patterns rather than promises. They learned to observe outcomes rather than listen to words. And what they observed was that engagement often led to risk without reward, responsibility without respect, and obligation without appreciation. There is a difficult truth here that many people do not want to confront. Men have historically stood between women and the harshest realities of life. That buffering role was not glamorous, and it was rarely acknowledged, but it existed. When men step back, reality does not soften. It becomes sharper. Bills still arrive. Work still demands effort. Security still requires planning. And now, many are encountering these pressures directly for the first time. Men did not leave out of spite, they left because they were pushed. Over time, the message became clear: do not approach, do not speak, do not lead, do not expect gratitude, do not expect loyalty, do not expect fairness. Eventually, the cost benefit calculation changed. Men realized that peace was more valuable than validation, and stability was more valuable than approval. Once men adjusted to this new way of living, something else happened. They stopped chasing, they stopped paying for attention, they stopped trying to prove their worth to people who had already decided it was insufficient. They focused inward, many simplified their lives, they reduced unnecessary expenses, they prioritized health, hobbies, and personal goals. In doing so, they found that their needs were far fewer than they had been told. Minimalism did not feel like deprivation, it felt like freedom. Without the pressure to perform, impress, or provide beyond reason, many men discovered that they required very little to feel content. A stable routine, financial control, quiet evenings, personal projects. These things became enough. In some cases, they became more than enough. This is why the calls for men to return are not working. From the outside, it looks like stubbornness. From the inside, it feels like self preservation. Men remember what life was like before they stepped away. They remember the rules constantly changing. They remember being judged by standards that were never applied equally. And they ask themselves a simple question: what has changed that would make returning a good decision? So far, the answer has been very little. We are also seeing a growing divide between narrative and reality. Public messaging still insists that everything is fine, that independence is empowering, and that anyone struggling simply made poor individual choices. But the volume of voices telling a different story keeps increasing. When large numbers of people experience the same difficulty at the same time, it is no longer an individual failure. It is a systemic issue. Many women were told they could have everything without trade offs, careers without cost, independence without isolation, freedom without responsibility. Reality does not work that way for anyone. Every choice closes one door while opening another. Men learn this lesson early, often painfully. Many women are learning it now later than expected and under far more stressful conditions. This is not about punishment or revenge, it is about consequences. Consequences are not moral judgments, they are simply outcomes. When a society discourages cooperation between men and women for decades, the long term result is not harmony, it is fragmentation. When one side is told it is not needed long enough, eventually it believes it. Another important point that rarely gets discussed is that men did not replace women with something else. They did not suddenly find a new group to serve or sacrifice for. They chose themselves. That choice is deeply misunderstood. It is often framed as bitterness or withdrawal. In reality, it is boundary setting on a massive scale. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. Men began to ask why their time, money, and energy were always expected but rarely protected. They noticed that risk was socialized while responsibility was individualized. They saw that when things went wrong, accountability flowed in only one direction. Walking away became less about anger and more about sanity. Now, as economic conditions worsen, we are seeing a reversal of tone. Requests are replacing demands. Appeals are replacing accusations. But trust, once broken at scale, does not regenerate overnight. Men are cautious now. They observe actions closely. Words alone no longer carry weight. The idea that men will return simply because conditions have become difficult misunderstands what men experienced before leaving. Many men felt that no matter what they did, it was never enough. No matter how much they provided, it was never appreciated for long. No matter how much they compromised, the expectations kept rising. When you remove someone from that environment and they discover peace, convincing them to return requires more than urgency. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men have learned they are not responsible for fixing every problem they did not create. Responsibility without authority leads to resentment. Obligation without respect leads to withdrawal. These lessons were learned slowly, often quietly, and they are not easily unlearned. We are also seeing a change in how men relate to time. In the past, men delayed gratification for future rewards that often never materialized. Today, many men value the present more highly. They are less willing to sacrifice years of peace for promises that may collapse under pressure. They prioritize sustainability over approval. This shift is why you see fewer men dating, fewer men pursuing marriage, and fewer men engaging in traditional provider roles. It is not because men hate women, it is because men have recalibrated what they are willing to risk. They have learned that walking away is sometimes the most rational decision available. As social structures strain, the contrast becomes sharper. Some women are discovering that independence without support can feel isolating. Some are realizing that career success does not replace companionship. Some are facing the reality that financial systems are not designed to guarantee comfort indefinitely. These realizations are painful, but they are not unique. Men went through similar awakenings in different ways. The difference is timing. Men adapted earlier because pressure forced them to. Women are adapting later because the systems they relied on are now under stress. Neither experience is easy, but the responses differ because the lessons were learned under different conditions. What we are witnessing now is not the end of cooperation between men and women, but a reckoning. Relationships built on imbalance cannot survive indefinitely. Stability requires mutual respect, realistic expectations, and shared responsibility. Without those foundations, no amount of urgency can restore what was lost. Men walking away is not a slogan. It is a description of behavior. It is what happens when incentives disappear and risks remain. It is what happens when peace becomes more valuable than participation. And it is why calls for rescue are being met with silence. The situation continues to unfold, and more people will be forced to confront uncomfortable questions about dependency, choice, and responsibility. Some will adapt, some will struggle, some will double down on old narratives. But reality does not negotiate. For a long time, men were told that if they just communicated better, worked harder, and adapted faster, everything would stabilize. Many tried exactly that. They adjusted their language, their behavior, their expectations, and even their ambitions. They were told to be softer while still being strong, to be providers without authority, and to take responsibility without receiving protection. Over time, these contradictions piled up. When rules become impossible to satisfy, rational people stop playing the game. This withdrawal did not happen overnight. It was gradual, almost invisible at first. Fewer men initiating conversations, fewer men asking for dates, fewer men volunteering emotional labor, fewer men stepping forward when something needed to be fixed. Each step back was small, but together they created a noticeable absence. That absence is now being felt in ways many did not anticipate. One of the most striking aspects of this shift is how little drama accompanied it. There were no mass protests, no organized campaigns, no ultimatums. Men simply opted out. In a society that often measures power through noise, silence became the loudest signal. Silence is hard to argue with. You cannot shame someone who is no longer present. You cannot negotiate with someone who has disengaged. As men stepped away, many women continued to operate under the assumption that men would return when needed. History reinforced that belief. In previous generations, when conditions worsened, men stepped up. They worked longer hours, took on additional burdens, and absorbed stress quietly. This time, something different happened. Men looked at the situation and asked themselves whether stepping back in would lead to a different outcome than before. For many, the answer was no. A key misunderstanding lies in how sacrifice is perceived. Sacrifice makes sense when it leads to stability, appreciation, and continuity. It feels pointless when it leads to criticism, disposability, and replacement. Over time, many men concluded that their sacrifices were no longer valued as sacrifices, but expected as obligations. When obligation replaces choice, motivation disappears. This is why appeals based on urgency are failing. Panic does not inspire trust. Desperation does not rebuild confidence. Men are watching closely, not just listening. They are asking whether the environment that pushed them away has truly changed, or whether the tone has only softened temporarily due to pressure. Another element worth examining is how social validation shifted. In the past, men received status and respect through contribution. Today, public narratives often reward visibility rather than utility. Men who build, maintain, and stabilize systems operate quietly. Men who opt out disrupt expectations without seeking applause. That quiet disruption is unsettling for systems that rely on predictable participation. Meanwhile, many women were encouraged to center identity around independence without acknowledging the cost of isolation. Independence sounds appealing until support disappears. Self reliance sounds empowering until circumstances overwhelm individual capacity. The difference between independence and interdependence becomes clearer when systems fail. Men, having already experienced social isolation, adapted differently. They learned to self regulate emotionally. They learned to find meaning outside of validation. They learned that peace is not boring and quiet is not empty. These lessons are difficult to unlearn once integrated. There is also a generational component to this shift. Younger men observed what happened to older men and adjusted earlier. They watched careers collapse, marriages dissolve, and social trust erode. They learned through observation rather than experience, which accelerated withdrawal. When patterns repeat often enough, recognition replaces hope. At the same time, economic pressure exposes uncomfortable truths about labor value. Many roles that were marketed as fulfilling turned out to be fragile. Many pathways promised stability but delivered volatility. When these pathways collapse, people look for external support. Historically, that support came from family structures anchored by male provision. When those structures weaken, uncertainty increases. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observation. Systems require maintenance, relationships require balance. When either side believes the other is optional, cooperation erodes. The expectation that one group will endlessly compensate for systemic instability is unrealistic. Another critical factor is how trust has been reframed. Trust used to be built through consistency over time. Today, it is often demanded upfront and withdrawn instantly. Men learned that one misstep could erase years of effort. Under those conditions, investing deeply feels risky. Withdrawal feels safer. As more men choose safety over risk, society experiences a paradox. On one hand, there is increased individual stability for those who withdraw. On the other hand, there is increased collective instability because fewer people are willing to shoulder shared burdens. This creates a feedback loop. As systems weaken, more individuals disengage. As more individuals disengage, systems weaken further. The conversations emerging online often miss this feedback loop. They focus on symptoms rather than causes. They ask why men are not returning without addressing why they left. They frame the situation as abandonment rather than adaptation. But from the male perspective, this is not abandonment, it is boundary enforcement, and boundaries are rarely celebrated. They are often interpreted as rejection. Yet boundaries are essential for sustainability. Men learned that without boundaries, their energy was endlessly consumed. With boundaries, they regained control over their time and resources. It is also important to acknowledge that not all men are thriving. Withdrawal does not guarantee happiness, but even men who struggle within solitude often prefer that struggle to the instability they experienced before. Predictable difficulty is easier to manage than unpredictable chaos. As the economy continues to strain, narratives will continue to shift. Some will attempt to reframe dependency as partnership without addressing past dynamics. Others will demand solutions without accountability. Men are watching how these narratives evolve. They are not rushing to respond. What is rarely acknowledged is that many men are open to cooperation under different conditions. They are not opposed to relationships. They are opposed to imbalance. They are not opposed to commitment. They are opposed to disposability. These distinctions matter. Restoring cooperation requires more than nostalgia. It requires honest reflection. It requires acknowledging that certain behaviors, incentives, and systems failed. Without that acknowledgement, trust cannot be rebuilt. As more women voice concern about survival, it becomes clear that economic independence without relational stability is fragile. Community matters, family matters, mutual reliance matters. These truths were not erased by ideology, they were temporarily ignored. Men, having already internalized these lessons, are unlikely to rush back into roles that previously drained them. They will wait, they will observe, they will choose carefully if they choose at all. This moment forces society to confront a simple but uncomfortable reality. Stability cannot be demanded, it must be cultivated. Cooperation cannot be coerced, it must be earned. When people feel valued, they contribute. When they feel exploited, they withdraw. The silence from men is not confusion, it is clarity. It is the result of years of observation, reflection, and adjustment. It is not loud, but it is deliberate. And as this story continues to unfold, the outcomes will depend on whether lessons are learned or ignored. Systems can adapt, relationships can evolve, but only if honesty replaces slogans and accountability replaces blame. Moving deeper into this conversation, It becomes necessary to address the question that sits quietly beneath all the noise, which is what rebuilding trust would actually require, not in theory, but in practice. Trust is not restored by slogans, pressure, or urgency. It is restored through consistent behavior over time, and that is precisely where the difficulty lies. Many men are not convinced that the underlying conditions that drove them away have fundamentally changed, and without that conviction, there is no incentive to return. For years, men were encouraged to ignore their instincts and defer to narratives that contradicted their lived experience. When those instincts warned them that something was off, they were told the problem was internal. Over time, men learned to stop outsourcing their judgment. They began relying on pattern recognition rather than promises. Once that shift happens, it is extremely difficult to reverse because it is grounded in observation rather than belief. A major obstacle to rebuilding trust is the refusal to acknowledge asymmetry. Relationships cannot function when one side is expected to absorb disproportionate risk. Many men saw that emotional, financial, and legal risks were not shared evenly. When things went well, success was collective. When things went poorly, blame was individual. That imbalance taught men a lesson they will not forget easily. Another overlooked factor is the role of public shaming. The widespread use of recording devices, online callouts, and social judgment created an environment where mistakes carried permanent consequences. Men learned that a single misunderstanding could spiral into reputational damage with no due process and no path to recovery. Under those conditions, disengagement becomes a rational form of self defense. This environment also changed how men perceive vulnerability. Vulnerability without safety is exposure. Many men were encouraged to open up emotionally, only to find that their disclosures were later used against them. That experience taught caution. Emotional restraint is not repression when it is learned through consequence, it is adaptation. As men adapted, they also reevaluated what fulfillment looks like. Many realized that fulfillment does not require constant stimulation or external validation. It requires stability, autonomy, and a sense of control over one's environment. These qualities are easier to maintain alone than in systems where expectations are fluid and accountability is unclear. The idea that men are thriving while women struggle is an oversimplification, but it captures a directional truth. Men who opted out early had time to adjust. They simplified their lives before pressure peaked. They reduced debt, limited obligations, and recalibrated expectations. When conditions worsened, they were already positioned defensively. By contrast, many women were encouraged to pursue lifestyles that assumed perpetual economic growth and institutional support. When those assumptions weaken, the adjustment is more abrupt. Sudden instability feels overwhelming because there was little preparation for contraction. This difference in preparedness contributes to the visible contrast we see today. Another element worth discussing is how language shaped behavior. For years, men were described as replaceable or unnecessary. Language matters because it signals value. When people internalize the belief that they are unwanted, they stop offering themselves. Reversing that belief requires more than a change in tone. It requires a change in treatment. Men are not unaware of attempts to soften rhetoric. They see it, but they also notice when accountability is absent. Apologies without behavioral change feel tactical rather than sincere. Men are no longer motivated by words alone. They are motivated by demonstrated shifts in incentives. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this moment is the assumption that men owe society participation. Participation is not an obligation, it is an exchange. When the exchange becomes unfavorable, withdrawal is not rebellion, it is choice. Men did not sign contracts requiring them to sacrifice indefinitely, regardless of outcome. This choice is often framed as selfishness. Yet, self preservation is not selfish when systems are unstable. It is prudent. Men are choosing to protect what they can control rather than gamble on structures that have proven unreliable. That choice may frustrate those who expected automatic support, but frustration does not create obligation. As economic pressures intensify, some voices argue that crisis should override caution. They suggest that hard times demand collective sacrifice. But sacrifice requires trust, and trust cannot be demanded under duress. It must exist beforehand. Without it, calls for unity ring hollow. Another important factor is that many men discovered they were carrying invisible labor that went unrecognized. Once that labor stopped, its absence became noticeable. This has led to confusion. People are asking why things feel harder without realizing who was quietly making them easier. This realization is uncomfortable because it challenges narratives that minimized male contribution. Acknowledging that contribution does not diminish anyone else. It simply restores balance to the conversation. Balance is necessary if cooperation is to resume. The path forward, if one exists, will not look like a return to the past. It cannot. Too much has changed. Technology, economics, and social norms have shifted permanently. Any future cooperation will require new frameworks grounded in realism rather than idealism. Those frameworks must include clear expectations, shared risk, and mutual accountability. They must respect boundaries and acknowledge differences rather than pretending they do not exist. Men are not asking for dominance, they are asking for fairness. Fairness also includes recognizing that not all men left for the same reasons. Some left due to personal experience, others left due to observation, some left quietly, others never entered at all. Understanding this diversity matters because one size solutions will fail. As more people confront economic hardship, the temptation to assign blame will increase. Blame feels satisfying in the short term, but solves nothing. The real issue is structural. Incentives shaped behavior, and behavior shaped outcomes. Changing outcomes requires changing incentives. Men are open to environments where contribution is valued and risk is shared. They are resistant to environments where contribution is assumed and risk is unilateral. This distinction explains much of what we are seeing. It is also important to address the emotional toll of constant conflict. Many men experienced years of tension in personal and public spaces. Stepping away reduced that tension dramatically. Peace became addictive. Once experienced, it becomes a baseline rather than a luxury. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame only reinforces the decision to withdraw. Respect invites engagement. Pressure repels it. As conversations continue, some will argue that solitude is unsustainable, that humans need connection. This is true, but connection does not require exposure to instability. Men are finding connection through friendships, communities, and shared interests that do not carry the same risks. This diversification of connection reduces dependence on any single relationship model. When dependence decreases, leverage disappears. This shift changes negotiation dynamics fundamentally. We are entering a period where old assumptions no longer apply. Automatic roles are dissolving. Participation is becoming optional. In this environment, cooperation must be compelling rather than compulsory. Looking forward, it is important to confront a reality that many people avoid because it feels destabilizing, which is that the option to walk away changes the balance of every relationship and every system. When participation is no longer guaranteed, incentives matter again. For a long time, many structures operated as if men would always show up no matter the cost. That assumption shaped policies, social norms, and expectations. Once that assumption collapsed, everything built on top of it began to wobble. In earlier eras, men were socialized to endure discomfort quietly. Endurance was framed as virtue. Complaining was framed as weakness. Many men complied with this conditioning because it gave their suffering meaning. They believed endurance would lead to stability, family, respect, and legacy. When those outcomes became uncertain or disappeared altogether, endurance lost its purpose. And a system that relies on endurance without reward eventually exhausts its participants. Exhausted people do not revolt, they retreat. Retreat is quieter, but far more difficult to reverse. That is the stage we are now in. Men did not leave in anger. They left after acceptance. Acceptance is final. In a way, anger is not. This is why so many appeals feel disconnected from reality. They assume men are still emotionally invested in outcomes they already released. But once someone has emotionally exited a system, urgency does not pull them back. It only confirms their decision. Panic signals instability. Instability repels people who have learned the value of peace. Another layer worth examining is how men now perceive responsibility. Responsibility used to be tied to authority and respect. You were responsible for what you could influence. Over time, that relationship fractured. Men were held responsible for outcomes they could not control, decisions they did not make, and systems they did not design. Responsibility without control creates frustration. Over time, it also creates disengagement. Walking away restored alignment. Men became responsible only for what they chose: their finances, their health, their time, their peace. This alignment reduced stress dramatically. When people experience lower stress, they protect it. They do not trade it lightly. And there's also a misunderstanding about masculinity that complicates this conversation. Masculinity is often framed as dominance or conquest. In reality, for many men, masculinity is stewardship. It is the desire to build, protect, and maintain. Stewardship requires trust that what you build will not be dismantled arbitrarily. When that trust erodes, stewardship stops. Men did not stop caring, they stopped investing where investment felt unsafe. That distinction matters. It explains why men still show up reliably in environments with clear rules, shared goals, and predictable outcomes. Workplaces with merit based systems, friendships with mutual respect, hobbies with measurable progress. These spaces reward effort consistently. Many relationship and social structures no longer did. As men withdrew, they also noticed how much emotional energy had been consumed by constant negotiation. Negotiation over boundaries, negotiation over expectations, negotiation over fairness. Removing themselves from that dynamic freed cognitive and emotional resources. That freedom is not easily surrendered. Meanwhile, cultural messaging continued to promise that independence would feel empowering indefinitely. Independence does feel empowering at first. It feels like control. Over time, however, independence without support becomes isolation. The difference between chosen solitude and enforced solitude becomes clear under pressure. Many women are now encountering that difference. When systems strain and support networks thin, isolation feels heavier. It is not a failure, it is a natural human response. Humans evolved to cooperate, but cooperation requires mutual respect and reciprocity. Men have not forgotten how to cooperate, they have become selective. Selection is not rejection, it is discernment. Discernment develops when experience teaches caution. Another uncomfortable truth is that some men realize they were more valued for what they provided than for who they were. Once they stopped providing, interest disappeared. That realization was painful but clarifying. It led many men to ask whether returning would change that dynamic. So far, they see little evidence. As economic conditions tighten further, the pressure to rebuild cooperation will increase. But pressure alone cannot rebuild trust. In fact, Pressure often exposes underlying fractures. People show who they are when resources are scarce. Men are watching those reactions carefully. There is also the issue of timing. Trust requires time, but crises demand quick solutions. This creates a mismatch. Those seeking immediate relief want rapid engagement. Those being asked to engage want long term stability. These timelines do not align easily. This mismatch explains much of the frustration on both sides. One side feels abandoned, the other feels cautious. Neither perspective is inherently wrong, but they are incompatible without adjustment. Adjustment requires humility. It requires acknowledging that previous assumptions failed, that narratives oversimplified reality, that incentives produced unintended consequences. Without humility, conversations turn into demands rather than dialogue. Men are no longer motivated by being needed. They want to be wanted under fair conditions. Being needed implies obligation. Being wanted implies choice. Choice is foundational to sustainable cooperation. Another element reshaping behavior is technological insulation. Men can now meet many needs without traditional relationships. Entertainment, community, learning, and even purpose are accessible independently. This reduces pressure to compromise for access. When alternatives exist, leverage changes. And this does not mean technology replaces human connection. It means it reduces desperation. Desperation distorts decision making. Reduced desperation leads to higher standards. As standards rise, some connections become untenable. This is not cruelty, it is calibration. People adjust expectations based on experience. The narrative that men are abandoning society ignores the reality that society changed first. Men adapted to those changes. Adaptation is not rebellion, it is survival. Survival strategies vary. Some men build quiet lives, some invest in skills, some focus on health, some build small, stable communities. These strategies share a common thread. They prioritize controllable variables. Large systems are difficult to control. Personal environments are easier. Men shifted focus accordingly. As this shift continues, the question is not whether men will return en masse. The question is whether systems will evolve to make participation worthwhile again. That evolution requires more than economic recovery. It requires cultural recalibration. Cultural recalibration begins with acknowledging contributions without attaching conditions. It begins with respecting boundaries rather than testing them. It begins with fairness rather than expectation. Until those conditions emerge consistently, withdrawal will remain the safer option for many men. This does not mean permanent separation. It means delayed engagement. It means observation before investment. It means patience over impulse. Patience is often misinterpreted as indifference. In reality, it is discernment. Discernment develops when stakes are high. The path forward will not be uniform. Some will adapt quickly, others will resist. Some structures will reform, others will collapse. This is how transitions unfold. The outcome will depend on whether lessons are integrated or ignored, whether respect replaces rhetoric, whether accountability replaces blame. Men are not asking to be saved. They are not asking to be praised. They are asking for environments where effort leads to stability rather than vulnerability. If those environments emerge, cooperation will follow naturally. If they do not, silence will continue. It is necessary to examine how these dynamics are shaping the next generation. Because cultural patterns do not reset with each decade, they compound. Young men are watching everything unfold in real time. They are absorbing lessons not from speeches or textbooks, but from outcomes. What they see matters more than what they are told. Many young men grew up hearing that effort would be rewarded, that cooperation would be reciprocal, and that stability would follow compliance. What they observed instead was inconsistency. They saw men who followed every rule still lose their footing. They saw promises dissolve under pressure. They saw that doing everything right did not guarantee security. That observation changed how they approach adulthood. Instead of rushing into traditional paths, many young men are delaying decisions. They delay commitment, they delay risk, they delay participation. This delay is often misinterpreted as laziness or immaturity. In reality, it is caution. When systems appear unstable, cautious behavior is adaptive. Young men are also learning to value optionality. Optionality means maintaining the ability to choose rather than being locked into irreversible commitments. This mindset prioritizes flexibility over tradition. It values skill acquisition, financial control, and personal autonomy. These priorities are not antisocial, they are defensive. Education pathways reflect this shift. Young men are less likely to pursue degrees that promise status without stability. They are more likely to pursue practical skills that translate across industries. They are skeptical of narratives that emphasize prestige over utility. Utility feels safer when the future is uncertain. Relationships are also viewed through this lens. Young men are asking different questions than previous generations. Instead of asking how to fit into existing expectations, they ask whether those expectations make sense. They ask what the cost will be if things go wrong. They ask whether the system protects them as much as it expects from them. These questions are not cynical, they are informed. When information is widely available, ignorance becomes a choice. Young men are choosing awareness. Awareness reduces vulnerability. Another important factor shaping the next generation is visibility. Previous generations of men suffered quietly. Their struggles were rarely discussed openly. Today, those struggles are visible online. Stories are shared. Patterns are recognized. Visibility accelerates learning. When young men see repeated accounts of similar outcomes, they adjust their behavior preemptively. They do not need to experience the loss themselves to internalize the risk. This accelerates withdrawal and reduces trial and error. What once took decades to learn now takes years. At the same time, young women are also absorbing lessons, though often different ones. They are seeing economic instability challenge assumptions. They are seeing independence tested by reality. They are navigating a world where support structures are less reliable than promised. This creates anxiety, but also opportunity for recalibration. The problem arises when recalibration is framed as entitlement rather than reflection. Cooperation cannot be rebuilt through expectation alone. It requires mutual adjustment. Young men are unlikely to respond to demands rooted in past assumptions. They respond to fairness and clarity. One of the most consequential shifts is how young men define success. Success is no longer measured solely by external markers. Many define success as peace, control, and sustainability. This definition is quieter but more resilient. It is harder to disrupt because it relies less on external validation. This shift also affects consumption. Young men are consuming less. They are opting out of status driven spending. They are reducing financial exposure. This frugality is not deprivation, it is strategic. Lower expenses reduce dependence. Reduced dependence increases leverage. Leverage changes negotiation dynamics across society. When people need less, they can demand more in terms of respect and fairness. This is one reason why old incentives are failing. They were built for a population that needed external approval and material validation. That population is shrinking. Another area affected by this shift is community. Young men are forming smaller, tighter communities based on shared interests rather than obligation. These communities are often informal, decentralized, and resilient. They provide connection without excessive demand. This does not mean isolation, it means selective engagement. Selective engagement preserves energy. Energy preservation becomes critical in unstable environments. As young men internalize these strategies, the long term implications become clear. Systems that rely on automatic participation will continue to struggle. Systems that adapt to voluntary participation will survive. This applies to relationships, workplaces, and institutions alike. The tension arises when older narratives clash with new behaviors. Some interpret withdrawal as hostility, others interpret caution as rejection. These interpretations escalate conflict unnecessarily. In reality, much of what is happening is quiet adaptation, and adaptation is not dramatic. It does not announce itself, it simply changes behavior. Over time, behavior reshapes norms. Norms reshape expectations. Expectations reshape systems. We are currently in the behavior phase. Norms are beginning to shift. Expectations are lagging. That lag creates friction. One example of this friction is the assumption that men will step in during crisis regardless of prior treatment. That assumption no longer holds. Young men have learned that stepping in without safeguards leads to exploitation. They require structure before contribution. Structure includes clear roles, shared accountability, and predictable outcomes. Without structure, engagement feels risky. Risk without reward is not appealing. This is why appeals based on guilt or nostalgia fail. They rely on outdated expectations. They do not address structural concerns. Young men are not motivated by guilt, they are motivated by logic. Logic asks simple questions. What is the cost? What is the benefit? What is the risk? What is the safeguard? These questions are being asked more openly than ever before. As more young men adopt this analytical approach, emotional appeals lose effectiveness. Emotional appeals work when trust is high. When trust is low, they feel manipulative. Trust is rebuilt through consistency. Consistency requires time. Time is scarce during crisis. This creates a paradox. Those seeking immediate relief want quick engagement. Those being asked want long term assurance. Resolving this paradox requires patience. It requires accepting that rebuilding will be slow. It requires respecting boundaries rather than attempting to bypass them. Future generations will judge this moment based on how adults respond. Will they double down on failed narratives or will they adapt to new realities? Will they listen to outcomes or will they insist on ideology? Young men are already choosing adaptation. They are building lives that minimize exposure to volatility. They are prioritizing stability over approval. They are not loud about it. They do not need to be. This quiet recalibration will shape society more than any debate. Debates change language, behavior changes reality. As this recalibration continues, some institutions will resist. Resistance will increase friction. Others will adapt. Adaptation will reduce friction. Over time, outcomes will favor those who adapt. The lesson for anyone paying attention is simple. Cooperation must be mutually beneficial. Participation must be voluntary. Stability must be earned through fairness. If those conditions are met, engagement will return organically. If they are not, withdrawal will remain rational. When we turn our attention to the economic layer of this shift, the picture becomes even clearer because labor markets do not lie. They reflect behavior, not ideology. For decades, economic systems quietly depended on a steady supply of male participation that was assumed to be permanent. Men would work longer hours, take on riskier roles, and absorb instability because that was expected of them. When expectations change, but incentives do not, labor responds by withdrawing, and that is exactly what we are seeing now. Across many sectors, participation is declining in ways that cannot be explained solely by laziness or lack of opportunity. Men are still willing to work, but they are increasingly selective about how, where, and under what conditions. They are prioritizing roles that offer autonomy, predictability, and proportional reward. When those elements are absent, disengagement becomes a rational choice rather than a protest. One of the most misunderstood trends is the rise of underemployment among men who are capable of earning more but choose not to. From the outside, this looks like wasted potential. From the inside, it is risk management. High income often comes with high exposure. Exposure to stress, legal vulnerability, social scrutiny, and expectations that extend far beyond compensation. Many men have concluded that reducing exposure is worth more than maximizing income. This recalibration has ripple effects. When fewer men are willing to carry disproportionate loads, systems that relied on that imbalance begin to strain. Deadlines slip, services degrade, costs rise. These are not moral failures, they are mechanical outcomes. When inputs change, outputs change. At the same time, many economic narratives continue to assume infinite elasticity. They assume people will stretch indefinitely to meet demand. Reality proves otherwise. Elasticity has limits. Once exceeded, systems snap rather than stretch further. Another critical factor is how risk is distributed. In many environments, men observed that risk was privatized while reward was socialized. When things went well, credit was shared. When things went wrong, liability concentrated. Over time, this taught men to avoid environments where downside was unlimited and upside was capped. This lesson is now shaping entrepreneurial behavior as well. Many men are building small, contained ventures rather than pursuing large scale ambitions. Smaller systems are easier to control. They allow for correction without catastrophe. This preference reflects a broader trend toward resilience over growth. Growth narratives dominated for decades. Growth at all costs, scale at all costs. But growth amplifies fragility when foundations are weak. Men who experienced collapse firsthand are wary of rebuilding on unstable ground. They prefer modest stability to impressive volatility. This shift also explains changes in geographic mobility. Men are less willing to relocate for uncertain opportunities. They are anchoring themselves in environments where cost of living is manageable and social pressure is lower. Stability is increasingly local rather than aspirational. As labor participation changes, institutions face a dilemma. They can adapt to new expectations or attempt to coerce participation through pressure. Pressure may work briefly, but it accelerates burnout and exit. Adaptation requires humility and restructuring. That process is slower but sustainable. Some institutions are already adjusting. They are offering clearer contracts, transparent expectations, and proportional rewards. In these environments, participation remains strong. Others resist change and experience chronic shortages. Outcomes reveal which approach works. Economic stress also exposes the limits of substitution. Technology can replace certain functions, but not all. Human judgment, maintenance, and responsibility cannot be fully automated. When those roles are undervalued, gaps emerge. Those gaps are now visible. As gaps widen, calls for collective responsibility increase. Yet collective responsibility cannot be invoked selectively. Men notice when responsibility flows in one direction. They notice when expectations rise without corresponding protection. These observations inform decisions. Another important dynamic is how financial independence intersects with emotional independence. Men who reduce financial dependence also reduce emotional leverage exerted over them. This reduces susceptibility to pressure. Reduced pressure tolerance changes negotiation dynamics. Negotiation now requires mutual benefit rather than obligation. This is a profound shift. It moves systems away from moral appeals toward practical alignment. Alignment requires listening to incentives rather than insisting on narratives. The economic consequences of the shift will not be evenly distributed. Some sectors will adapt and stabilize, others will contract. This contraction will be interpreted by some as failure, but it is also correction. Correction aligns capacity with willingness, and as correction unfolds, some voices will demand a return to previous norms. They will frame withdrawal as betrayal, but betrayal implies a promise was broken. Many men do not believe a fair promise existed in the first place. Promises that are implicit rather than explicit are easy to deny. Men learn this lesson through experience. They now seek clarity up front. Ambiguity feels dangerous. Clear terms feel safe. This preference for clarity extends beyond work into all forms of cooperation. Vague expectations are avoided. Undefined roles are rejected. Open-ended commitments are scrutinized. These behaviors reduce conflict, but also reduce spontaneity. Spontaneity once compensated for imbalance. When enthusiasm fades, imbalance becomes obvious. Systems must then stand on structure rather than emotion. Many do not. As economic realities harden, we will see increased divergence between those who adapt and those who cling to outdated assumptions. Adaptation does not guarantee comfort, but it improves odds. Resistance increases friction and accelerates decline. Men are not immune to these pressures. They are simply responding differently. By lowering exposure, simplifying lives, and reducing dependency, they buffer themselves against shocks. This buffering is not perfect, but it is effective enough to reinforce the strategy. Reinforcement matters. Strategies that work persist. Strategies that fail are abandoned. This is how cultures evolve, not through decree, but through repetition. As more men succeed in building stable, low exposure lives, the model spreads. Others observe and imitate. Cultural change accelerates quietly. This quiet acceleration confuses commentators who expect visible movements. There are no banners, no slogans, just behavior. Behavior is harder to argue with than ideology. You cannot debate someone out of a lifestyle that works for them. You can only offer a better alternative. So far, many alternatives offered to men resemble the conditions they already left. That is why uptake is low. A viable alternative would need to address risk distribution, respect boundaries, and offer genuine reciprocity. Without those elements, engagement will remain limited, and as economic systems continue to adjust, the pressure to confront these realities will increase. Outcomes will speak louder than commentary. Now we are arriving at the final stretch of this discussion, and it becomes clear that what we are witnessing is not a temporary phase or a reaction that will simply fade when conditions improve. This is a structural shift in how people relate to systems, responsibility, and each other. When participation becomes optional rather than assumed, every institution is forced to confront its actual value proposition. This is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. Social stability has always depended on a delicate balance between expectation and reward. When expectations grow faster than rewards, participation declines. For a long time, that decline was masked by habit, obligation, and social pressure. Those forces are weakening. Habit erodes when outcomes disappoint. Obligation collapses when it feels one-sided. Social pressure loses power when individuals realize they can live well without compliance. The most profound consequence of the shift is that stability can no longer be enforced through guilt or tradition. It must be earned through fairness, transparency, and mutual benefit. This applies to relationships, workplaces, communities, and governments alike. When people feel respected and protected, they contribute willingly. When they feel exploited or disposable, they disengage quietly. One of the great misunderstandings of this moment is the belief that disengagement equals hostility. In many cases, it does not. It is neutrality. It is choosing not to participate rather than choosing to fight. Neutrality is powerful because it deprives systems of energy without creating open conflict. Systems that rely on constant input cannot function indefinitely under neutrality. This is why so many institutions appear confused. They are responding to disengagement as if it were rebellion, when it is actually withdrawal. Rebellion seeks attention. Withdrawal seeks peace. The remedies for rebellion do not work on withdrawal. Another important reality is that people who have learned to live with less are harder to control. Reduced consumption, reduced dependency, and reduced exposure all increase personal leverage. When individuals discover they can meet their needs independently, the threat of exclusion loses power. This changes everything, and this does not mean society will collapse overnight. Systems are resilient, but only when they adapt. Those that do not will experience slow erosion rather than dramatic failure. Services will degrade, participation will thin, expectations will be unmet. None of this will happen all at once, which is why it is often dismissed until it becomes undeniable. The long term risk is not that men refuse to contribute, but that systems fail to evolve quickly enough to make contribution worthwhile again. Evolution requires honesty. Honesty requires admitting that previous models no longer work. That admission is difficult for institutions built on legacy assumptions. And at the same time, there is opportunity here. A society where participation is voluntary can be healthier than one built on coercion. Voluntary participation encourages respect, it rewards alignment, it discourages exploitation. But reaching that outcome requires a willingness to redesign structures rather than defend them. Younger generations are already operating under this new paradigm. They assume nothing is guaranteed. They evaluate everything. They value flexibility over prestige and stability over image. These values will shape future systems, whether current institutions approve or not. If cooperation is to return in a meaningful way, it will look different than before. It will be slower. It will be more deliberate. It will involve clearer agreements and stronger boundaries. It will prioritize sustainability over intensity. This may feel less romantic, but it is more honest. Romance without stability collapses under pressure. Stability without respect breeds resentment. Sustainable cooperation requires both. It is also important to acknowledge that not everyone will benefit equally from this transition. Change always produces winners and losers. Those who adapt early gain advantage. Those who cling to outdated expectations experience frustration. This is not cruelty, it is consequence. The temptation to assign moral blame during periods of transition is strong. Blame simplifies complex problems, but blame does not build solutions. Understanding incentives does. When incentives align with human behavior, systems function. When they do not, systems struggle regardless of intention. Men walking away is not the cause of instability. It is a signal. It signals that incentives failed. It signals that risk became unacceptable. It signals that peace became more valuable than participation. Ignoring signals does not eliminate them. The question now is whether society will listen. Listening requires humility. It requires acknowledging that some narratives overshot reality. It requires accepting that cooperation cannot be demanded indefinitely without reciprocity. There is no guarantee that listening will happen quickly. Institutions change slowly, but individuals change faster. That is why behavior often shifts before policy. By the time systems respond, patterns are already established. The future will likely be defined by smaller, more resilient networks rather than large, centralized ones. Trust scales poorly, accountability scales poorly. Resilience often emerges at human scale. Men have gravitated toward that scale instinctively. This does not mean isolation or fragmentation must define the future. It means connection will be intentional rather than automatic. Intentional connection tends to be stronger because it is chosen rather than assumed. Looking ahead, the most realistic path forward is not a return to the past, but a negotiation with the present. That negotiation must be grounded in reality rather than nostalgia. It must accept that walking away is always an option now, and that option changes everything. When walking away is possible, cooperation must be earned every day. That sounds demanding, but it is also fair. Fairness is the foundation of durable systems. Men are not disappearing, they are recalibrating. They are deciding where their effort produces the least harm and the most stability. They are choosing environments that respect boundaries and reward contribution proportionally. This recalibration is not loud, it does not seek approval. It simply persists because it works. For those hoping to rebuild cooperation, the lesson is clear. Stop asking why people are not showing up and start asking whether the environment is worth showing up to. That question applies universally. As this chapter closes, remember that history is shaped less by speeches and more by quiet decisions repeated millions of times. We are living through such a moment now. The outcomes of this period will be studied long after the noise fades because they reveal something fundamental about human behavior. People will contribute when contribution is safe, respected, and meaningful. When it is not, they will conserve themselves. That is not bitterness. That is wisdom earned through experience. I want to know what you think about everything we discussed in this video. Do you agree with this perspective? Do you see it differently? Or do you think there is another path forward that is being overlooked? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation does not end here. And like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.